Hello and welcome to Origin Story. In each episode, we take an idea, figure or event from history. We explain its origins and we talk about how it influences political discourse today. I'm Dorian Lynskey, author of Everything Must Go and the Ministry of Truth.
And I'm Ian Dunt. I'm economist with the iNewspaper and the author of the Striking 13 newsletter.
And together we write the Origin Story books. That's fascism, conspiracy theory and, relevant to this episode, centrism. So we left the Labour Party as tradition dictates, on the eve of the Second World War.
Quite right.
Having had a very rough decade in the 1930s, with the great betrayal of Ramsay MacDonald and the coalition government in 1931, George Lansbury not being particularly well suited to the age of Hitler, and then Clement Attlee taking over as somebody who was very easy to underrate.
Which they did, right? Like almost all the coverage of Attlee when he comes over is just like, oh, well, I suppose they've managed to cover up this embarrassment for a little time, won't be around for long. Turns out he is actually going to be around for a very long time and maybe a more substantial figure than people had initially anticipated.
But this continues through the 40s. As he is Prime Minister, people constantly just going, oh, he's not very interesting. But as we can see, he got quite a lot done. So look, the Second World War, I think you could say is the best thing that ever happened to Labour.
Yes.
Right. I mean, you wouldn't choose for it to happen, but given that it did happen, right? Because basically it solves the patriotism problem that's haunted it from the beginning. It unites the classes in a common endeavour. It proves the effectiveness and kind of popularity of a version of central planning that has nothing to do with Stalin's version. And it also reminds people of the failure to make social reforms after the First World War and to sort of reward people for their sacrifice. So it seems like everything was sort of moving in Labour's direction.
It's funny, right? Because the war has been good for the Labour Party. And in fact, you could argue, like over the course of this season, for socialists in general, the Bolsheviks did very well, out of the First World War as well.
Suffragettes did well.
Exactly. So there's that real sense that war paradoxically helps, given how much war haunts the imaginations of socialists at the time. But the Second World War is also not like other wars. It's not divisive on the left. The left as a whole can support this thing. It kind of starts to kill off that unhelpful, unpopular view on the British left that wars are just sort of like struggles between the ruling classes of various countries. Because that analysis just doesn't work in the Second World War. And it can only be found on the fringes. So actually, it's not just that wars in general help socialism, much to its own dismay. It's that this particular war was very, very helpful to the left.
So it's Clement Attlee who pulls the trigger on Neville Chamberlain in May 1940 and allows Churchill to become Prime Minister, and then joins the coalition, the war cabinet. There's 16 Labour ministers to start off with, and by the end of the war, 27. So you've got Attlee as Lord Privy Seal, Ernest Bevan as Minister of Labour and National Service, Herbert Morrison, Minister of Supply, and Hugh Dalton, Minister for Economic Warfare, and on and on. These are the big figures of the 20s and 30s that we talked about last time. And I came across somebody referring to the wartime coalition as the third Labour government, in essence.
Oh, wow. What a thing to say.
Now, the left-wing rebels of the 1930s take different paths. Now, through Tribune, the newspaper, set up by Stafford Cripps, who we mentioned before, you've got Nye Bevan and Harold Lasky. There's a special episode you did on Harold Lasky.
We did, indeed. He has his Costa Coffee card, and you should get your Origin Story Costa Coffee card by listening to that episode.
That's, I think that's for patrons only, so that's an incentive to sign up. They hound, that sounded sarcastic, it isn't. It's a really good episode. So they hound Attlee and Churchill throughout the war for doing the war wrong. So this is a good time to introduce the other Bevan, Aneurin Bevan. Born into a mining family in Tredegar, South Wales in 1897, became a miner himself and a trade union leader. Quite unusual in Labour circles in being rooted in Marxism and class struggle. I mean, obviously Lasky was, but most Labour people were not that interested in Marxism. So he was interested in basically getting more power for the workers. Leading figure in the general strike, becomes MP for Tredegar in 1929. So I think that he is, in Labour history, an heir to Keir Hardie, the sort of politician as prophet rather than operator. He doesn't necessarily understand the machinery of power, but he could be an inspirational orator, fearless fighter for his principles. When people talk about Bevan, he is almost the embodiment of principle and moral vigour. Everybody who works with him says that he could be egotistical, stubborn, self-defeating. And someone told Ernest Bevan that Nye was his own worst enemy, and Ernest replied, "Not while I'm alive, he ain't." So do not mix up your Bevans. They would not have appreciated it. The other way I think he's interesting is he embodies the left's frustrations with Labour. This can't live with it, can't live without it. So when the independent Labour Party was first talking about disaffiliation in the early 30s, which it then proceeded to do, Nye has this argument with this MP, Jenny Lee, who becomes his wife. Very impressive figure in her own right. And he says, "I tell you, it is the Labour Party or nothing. I know all its faults, all its dangers, but it is the party that we have taught millions of working people to look to and regard as their own." And it is a constant dilemma for Bevan, who is actually in and out of the party quite a lot. And I think probably anyone on the Labour left is, should I stay or should I go? And we see to this day, most people stay.
I mean, this is the conversation that they're having right at the moment. They've had it my entire life. And the only times they're not having it is in the rare sporadic moments that they take charge when the right has it. And then has with pretty much the same results. Like mostly they stay and occasionally they go, and it never really works out very well for them.
So Nye Bevan is the editor of Tribune. He was expelled from Labour just before the war for supporting Stafford Cripps' call for a united front with the communists. Bevan tries twice to break up the coalition, thinking it is killing Labour. And is almost expelled again.
Jesus.
And Tribune, under his editorship, compares Attlee to Ramsay MacDonald, the great villain of Labour history, the passing of yet another socialist into the limbo of collaboration.
It's incredible. And this did come up in the last episode of this sort of uncritical view that we have of that period internally in Britain doesn't stand up to scrutiny. There is a lot of effort within Labour to sort of say, we're getting spanked here. You know, we're going to end up getting really punished for this by the electorate. We need to peel apart the coalition, or we need to get rid of Attlee, or just basically like a bunch of game playing in the middle of the Second World War, when you would have thought people really should be up to smarter things.
But Stafford Cripps, who owns Tribune and is equally left-wing, he takes a completely different path, becomes ambassador to the USSR, negotiates an alliance with Stalin after Operation Barbarossa against Hitler. He's so popular, this amazed me, there was even for a while speculation about him becoming the next PM after Churchill.
Oh, wow.
Instead, he replaces Attlee as Lord Privy Seal, so Attlee becomes Deputy Prime Minister and, crucially, Secretary of State for the Dominions, because Churchill is not trusted in the empire because he is an imperialist. Whereas Attlee, because he was involved, if you hear in the petition episodes, in the Simon Commission before the war, very committed to Indian independence. So this is, again, one of those kind of wartime roles that proves really important to what he is able to do afterwards. Now, as early as May 1941, when there is absolutely no guarantee the war will be won, but people in Labour are already planning for post-war reconstruction, already thinking ahead. Thinking ahead is a great asset if you want to form a government.
Yes, although one that Labour has rarely engaged in.
Yeah. But I love the fact they were doing it literally in the pit of the Second World War. And you get the Beveridge Report in December 1942. Really worth mentioning here that the foundation stones of the post-war consensus are two liberals.
Yeah.
Beveridge and Keynes.
Exactly. Well, it's worth exploring that, I think, for a second, right? Because, we said at the beginning, once you don't have that very firm definition of socialism, so it's not just social ownership of the means of production, it's a broader thing of equality and redistribution in the market and competition and things. It's quite hard to find the species barrier between what is socialism and what is progressive liberalism, of the kind that sort of, Keynes would pursue.
Freedom from want and et cetera.
Exactly.
Socialist as well as liberal.
Most of these ideas, the real species barrier, funny, it is the clause 4 thing. That's the thing of like, here is the thing that liberals would not sign up to.
Which is state ownership of industry.
Of the means of production. Yeah, exactly. The sort of core kind of beating heart of what socialism would be in an abstract way. Without it, that species barrier is gone. And so you get this sort of scenario where these ideas that are really sort of, they're not really liberal ideas and they're not really socialist ideas. All of the things that are most praised from what Labour will go on to do could be held by anyone in the broad left, but they're not specifically socialist ideas. However, it takes a party like Labour to get behind them in a way that the Liberals had no sign of doing, at any period up to now. They were the ones that committed to the idea, even if the ideas themselves are not necessarily particularly socialist.
Well, there's an argument, again, in the belly of the war. The Beveridge Report was published in December 1942, and there was a split in Labour about how soon the recommendation should be adopted. This is where you get a very famous quote from Barbara Castle, citing, I think, Alice in Wonderland. Jam yesterday and jam tomorrow, but never jam today.
Oh, so you mean our colleague Ros Taylor didn't just invent that shit?
She doesn't know. She's not particularly obsessed with jam. Her podcast, Jam Tomorrow, now called More Jam Tomorrow, is actually really good on the post-war.
Oh, it's incredible. Yeah.
Covers a lot of the stuff we're talking about. There's a rebellion over Beveridge. And Attlee complains that Labour backbenchers tend to use their hearts to the exclusion of their heads. I fear our people cannot ever understand when they've won. In fact, they really prefer a glorious defeat in the lobbies to a victory. Which will happen again.
I mean, we can't just keep on saying, much like today. But, you'll just have to take it as
This
read.
is when Herbert Morrison, the old kind of everyone in the Labour government is quite old at this point, but, real heavyweight, famously calls Labour a suicide club. Now, at the end of 1942, 40% of voters tell Mass Observation that their political views have changed. That number is even higher in the armed forces.
That's so interesting.
Now, Labour actually has a poll lead of as much as 20 points over the Tories from 1943 onward. Again, something that we talk about because they're in coalition, and you just think, was there opinion polling about them? Yes, there was. March 44, Labour says it's going to leave the coalition as soon as the war in Europe is over. And again, the spectre of Ramsay MacDonald, the left is freaking out about a national government, the coalition, continuing after the war, which 1 in 3 voters support. We're quite happy to have an ongoing coalition. And this is the point where there's great anxiety. It's like if you don't split after VE Day, basically, then it could end up hurting you. And even then, there are people who are scared of defeat, because this is famously, 1945, famously a landslide win. Most people in Labour didn't think there would be one. Herbert Morrison actually didn't want an election early. He said it would be suicide and Labour would be cast into the wilderness for another generation. Which is extremely counterintuitive to me.
Yeah, so again, you think of their previous experience of what happened with the national government, which is you got the spanking of your life, in the election after that. Then you're running against Churchill, who was, lionised at that point. And the Churchill thing works 2 ways. I mean, lots of the literature at the time didn't really mention the Conservatives very much. It mentioned Churchill. The campaign was around Churchill.
Right.
And yet, Churchill wasn't just, the great lionised hero of the Second World War. He was also an incredibly canny and pragmatic politician. We remember that election for, the terrible things he said about, as if Labour would be run by the KGB and the blah, blah, blah.
They need a form of Gestapo.
Exactly, yes. But actually, the Conservative economic policy, and in fact, the Tory manifesto in general was probably as left-wing as that party has ever put to the public at election time. And it had signed up to the idea of creating a welfare state. The Conservative welfare state would have been much, much less radical than the one that Labour put in and probably built on the existing provisions that had already been established. But nevertheless, this was a Conservative party that recognised that the mood had fundamentally shifted towards the left.
The Beveridge Report.
Exactly, and needed to reflect it. And Churchill himself had clearly and explicitly said he would be reflecting that.
But Churchill, I think, with that Gestapo comment, which is infamous, and I think we've talked about it before, completely misreads the situation by getting nasty. And it doesn't land because Attlee he's been mild, he's been patriotic, he has been loyal. He's a very British socialist. And Churchill's own daughter says, socialism as practiced in the war did no one any harm and quite a lot of people good. Like, Dad, you're misreading this. This
is such a good point, isn't it? Because this is the attack that we've seen from the first moment that Labour got into government, right? So, you could take Gestapo and swap it out for, whatever, for the checker or something. But ultimately, it's like, these guys are commies and they will act like commie secret police and they'll take away all your freedom. And, there was some, actually not that, it wasn't that effective when it was first used against Labour, as we saw. Labour would probably have lost anyway. It worsened the degree of the loss. At this point, when you've had a period of just proving patriotism, proving over 2 decades that you can be trusted in government, that you're not just going to start killing the royal family and whatever else, it really is very hard to make it land. And Churchill did not make it land.
The Economist, in a very good quip, noted another way in which it wasn't convincing that Labour would be totalitarian. There are a few few groups of men less capable of moving in that direction than the leaders of the Labour Party, who have never been able to impose their wishes, even on their own followers. It's worth reading. You can find it online. We're going to link to it. The Labour manifesto. The Tory manifesto is called Mr. Churchill's Declaration of Policy to the Electors.
It doesn't mark out a huge amount of confidence in your brand
party,
to just not mention it at all.
Labour's is called Let's Face the Future. Sells 1.5 million copies.
Jesus Christ.
It's written by Herbert Morrison and Michael Young, sociologist, who later founded the Consumer Association, like Which Magazine, and the Open University, and less successfully fathered Toby Young. Mixed record.
Of those three, I would say the first two are rather more impressive than the last.
And the manifesto, interestingly, calls Labour a socialist party, and proudly so, whose ultimate purpose is the establishment of the socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain. Free, democratic, efficient, progressive, public-spirited.
Wow.
Very interesting framing about that version, very Attlee version of socialism. So the election is held on the 5th of July, 1945. The results don't come in until the 26th of July. Can you imagine now if you had to wait like 21 days?
People can't even handle it if they have to wait like more than one day.
It drives people mad even on the night, where you're like, I've got to wait up till 3. So the consensus is a hung parliament. The Daily Mail sternly warns, if Labour lose, they must accept an adverse verdict like men and not like spoilt children.
I wonder if they applied that test to themselves.
Instead, amusingly, Labour wins 390 seats with 12 million votes, not far off 50%. The American embassy reports no one was more surprised than were the leaders of the Labour Party. It really was not a foregone conclusion. And it makes them a national party for the first time. We talked before about localism, and about how you actually had to appeal very, very differently to voters in the East End or Clydeside or Liverpool, wherever. They absolutely dominate London, the Midlands, the North, Scotland, Wales, but also do well in the South, rural seats, real Tory heartlands. It's nice to think about.
I mean, this is the first time the party has had a majority. You know, they've now been in government 3 times, right? You know, this is the first time that they're on their own. They've had a majority. And by the way, that's not an extraordinary thing just for Britain, but for Europe. Like, other than Norway, this is the first time a socialist party had been able to govern without having to share power with another party. You know, it wasn't in a coalition. It wasn't in minority. It was pure majority government, full control. First time in Western Europe that had taken place other than Norway. So it's quite a seminal moment in socialist history in general, let alone just British politics.
So why did they win? George Orwell, writing about it, who, by the way, one of the people who predicted that Labour would lose.
Obviously.
It would be an exaggeration to say that the majority of these people voted for socialism. They voted for full employment, bigger old age pensions, the raising of the school leaving age, more social and economic equality, and more democracy all round.
I mean, that's a pretty good analysis.
It's a good analysis. But, you know, if you think about Labour's weaknesses, defence, foreign affairs, the economy, their traditional weaknesses, they've kind of like got rid of all those for their service in the war. They're just not scary. The Tories, meanwhile, people are very grateful to Churchill, but they remember the Great Depression and appeasement. The Tory MP, Harold Macmillan, says it was not Churchill who lost the election, it was the ghost of Neville Chamberlain.
Oh, wow. And
I think there's a lot in that. If you remember, Enoch Powell voted Labour in 1945, purely to punish the Tories for appeasement. Then proceeded to take a more rightward direction you may have heard of. So what we see here, for people who have been listening to the first episode, is all the big figures of the 30s that we've been talking about. They're in the cabinet. Herbert Morrison, Lord President of the Council. Hugh Dalton, Chancellor. Ernest Bevan, Foreign Secretary. Nye Bevan, Health Secretary. Stafford Cripps, President of the Board of Trade. Most of them went to state schools. 7 of the 26 were ex-miners. 2 from Eton. You've got to have some Etonians in there. Average age, though, was the mid-60s. Nye Bevan was the boy wonder at 47. A remarkably old cabinet.
It really teaches you something that this association we have in politics of like, you get young people in for a more dynamic government. This is about as dynamic a government as Britain has had in the 20th century, and it was just composed of really quite old men.
Well, when you think about it, thanks to the war, they had the experience. You've basically got a lot of ministers becoming ministers. They'd done the thinking. They'd done the planning. They'd done what often the Labour Party has failed to do and comes in with people that don't have that experience or thinking. Plus, a crop of young MPs who will dominate Labour for the next 40 years. We've got Harold Wilson, 29, from Huddersfield. The socialist historian G.D.H. Cole, who we used before, was his tutor at Oxford, encouraged him to join Labour Party.
It's actually getting quite meta because we're literally using G.D.H. Cole's books to talk about the history, which we are now discussing.
And Harold Wilson actually worked with Beveridge before the war. Michael Foote, 32, from Plymouth, son of a Liberal MP, journalist for Tribune, friend of Orwell's, campaigner for Indian independence. James Callaghan, 33, from Portsmouth. He's a working-class union official, served in the Royal Navy. Barbara Castle, 34, from Derbyshire, journalist for Tribune and the Daily Mirror. Richard Crossman, 37, classics lecturer, becomes the leading advocate for Zionism on the Labour left and one of the big figures on the Labour left. And Hugh Gaitskell, 39, from London, also became a socialist while studying with G.D.H. Cole at Oxford. You just walk into G.D.H. Cole's office and come out singing the red flag. Economist and civil servant during the war.
Jesus Christ, man, what an intake.
What an intake. And then over the next few years, and just like, in subsequent and by-elections, you get Roy Jenkins, Dennis Healey, Tony Benn all coming in the next few years. So this government obviously is revered now. I found speeches by both Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn,
of course,
where they're like, this is the benchmark for a Labour government. At the time, often seen as a wasted opportunity because Labour hates itself. And what's really striking, though, is that Clement Attlee governs according to the values that he has had since basically leaving the army at the end of the First World War and going into Labour politics. He's more interested in ethics than economics. He's mixing together. He's interested in freedom, but he's also interested in social virtue, rights and responsibilities. That's really important to his socialism. And he's also very into persuasion. And he thinks you have to win people round to your ideas. You have to be sort of pragmatic and careful. But he's also, even though he seems meek and mild, he's very precise and decisive. And one of the best observations I saw about him was that he just had this innate self-confidence which makes him tolerant. And the most intolerant leaders are the most insecure in themselves.
Yes, yes.
And he was just able to trust, to delegate, to maintain unity, to intervene, if things were getting too fractious. But he enabled people to he gave people space to thrive. It's quite remarkable leadership skills for somebody who in the context of the 1940s just didn't look like a leader at all.
This is an incredibly obvious thing to say, but given that we live in the age that we live in, I suppose it needs saying that one of the things about the democratic split in socialism is that it therefore requires persuasion. Mm-hmm. So you look at the history of socialism, we've now, this set of episodes is about Labour, the previous one was about essentially the Bolsheviks, the early Bolsheviks. And these are core symbols almost of that split in socialism between reform or revolution. And that was never discussed really as a democratic issue. That was discussed as a methodological issue. What's the most achievable way of getting to the socialism that we want to do? Well, we saw what happened in Russia when people pursued the revolution line. And now we're seeing how it works when people pursue the reform line, which is through parliament, meaning you have to win elections, meaning you have to bring people with you, meaning you have to moderate your program, but that also you're not just bludgeoning people into submission with ever more radical propositions. You have to bring them along. And it is so very, very obvious, I think, just how much prouder a heritage that is to be a part of than what we saw in the previous episodes.
Well, let's look at this enormously disappointing government. More active than any other British government of the 20th century. Nationalised 1/5 of the economy, including the Bank of England, electricity, gas, roads, railways, universal national insurance with no means testing, a big house building programme. Education, the only woman in the cabinet, Ellen Wilkinson, implements the 1944 Education Act, raises the school leaving age to 16, guarantees free education, establishes grammar schools. The historian Martin Pugh points out, and this startled me, that the welfare state, which was meant to be so expensive, just wasn't. Spending on social services was 37% in 1937, 40% in 1950. It wasn't this big bank-breaking thing at all. In fact, it was a better use of the money. Now, I suppose the thing that we most remember is that Attlee supported Nye Bevan over the 1946 National Health Service Act, despite the fact that Bevan spent the entire Second World War taking shots at him, which sort of says something about Attlee's ability to just...
Yes, it does.
And I think somebody else would have just never given Bevan that chance, never supported him. I think I would love to do an episode on the NHS at one point, so I'm not going to go into the mechanics of that. But it's obviously Bevan deserves enormous credit for it, but so does Attlee and other people in that government. It wasn't like a one-man show.
I think it's also worth clocking something about the NHS, right, which is that unlike Keynesianism and the Beveridge Report, there is something really fundamentally socialistic about that model of healthcare provision.
Bevan calls it pure socialism.
I think that's probably right. And the core thing, and you can see this in sort of other parts of what is done there, but really the NHS symbolizes it best, is it is completely universal. It's not just that it's free, it can be free and done by insurance and, done by private provision on a free basis. It is that it is universal, provided by the state on a universal basis. And almost no other country has that apart from the Scandinavian countries later on. Certainly at this point that it's done, in Western Europe, it's completely unheard of. When Marx, during our Marx episode, talked about alienation of labour, one of the reasons he had that labour was alienated was that you're providing for commerce, for profit, for only some other human beings. And that his view was that humankind you wanted to produce for the species, that was what it was to have unalienated labour, to make it for all mankind, basically. And we sort of know, and I think, by the way, and I think this is true, I think there's a truth here somewhere, that when you produce for commerce, even if it's something just costs 30p, you're sort of aware that not everyone gets to join in that club. It's contingent on having the money to afford it. Here, why do we feel so different when we walk into a hospital? Like, why is there this, what seems from outside Britain, this almost mad degree of affection for the NHS? I don't think that's for a particular sort of kind of health provision. I think it's because there is a sort of purity to any kind of provision that is universal in this way, that actually it's a product of what is socialistic about the NHS. Now, that may or may not be the best way of providing healthcare. I'm fucking genuinely not certain that it is. But I think the emotional and the social response to the NHS is partly a reflection of the fact that this is a genuinely very socialistic innovation to be sat right there at the heart of British society.
Well, it is. It's the essence of British socialism, isn't it? And what, the play about Nye Bevan omits also is just how the flip side of this great courage and punchiness was just getting in his own way. And something that people will still bring up is this speech he makes where he calls the Tories lower than vermin.
Right.
This was just a great bit of statesmanship.
Right.
Massive scandal at the time. Attlee calls him in and sort of scolds him. And Bevan goes, I love being the bugbear of the Tories. And Attlee says, you can't be the bugbear of the Tories and be regarded as a statesman. It's such an interesting clash between their personalities that Bevan, like so many people, like most figures on the Labour left, really sees themselves as an ambassador for the kind of people who are normally sort of excluded. So I speak for the backbenchers, I speak for the members, I speak for the, I speak for the workers. And therefore it has license to sort of speak as you wish.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's another kind of person who goes, look, I agree with your aims, but can you just not? So on the empire, Attlee basically realizes the empire is unaffordable and unjust. You can't fight a war for democracy and self-determination and sustain the British Empire. Plus, particularly on India, he was personally committed. He wasn't on Israel and the Israel-Palestine. In fact, asked in 1963 what he would like to be remembered for, he said, I don't know, India maybe?
Wow.
So Labour's Britain, it co-founds the UN, NATO, the Commonwealth, ECHR, Bretton Woods institutions through Keynes, the IMF, the World Bank, the Socialist International, which I wasn't really aware of, still exists. Labour Party is still a member. I don't know what it does. And works very closely with Ernest Bevan, who is very sort of pro-American, and this creates quite a lot of issues again with the Labour left, and certainly developing the nuclear deterrent becomes a problem for a very, very long time, for decades to come. Now, I think obviously from the partition episodes, we know that there were issues with Indian independence.
Yes.
And we talked through, where the blame could lie, how it might have been otherwise, et cetera. And in the Zionism episodes, we talked about the formation of Israel, which interestingly, and again, counterintuitive now, very much supported by the Labour left. That was the most passionately pro-Zionist wing of the party. And Attlee and Ernest Bevan were more concerned. So none of this stuff is unproblematic. There was one quote that stuck out for me. He's not talking about the foreign policy, but I thought this is very true about politics. James Callaghan, future Prime Minister at the time, junior Transport Minister. He is who we can thank for introducing cat's eyes and zebra crossings on Britain's roads.
Both good things.
Not bad for your first job in politics. The whole of politics is about taking decisions that are either bad or worse. You rarely take good ones.
Mm-hmm.
It's very Eeyore-ish, but probably accurate.
I mean, these were, we did cover in Partition just how dreadful that was and how dreadful a lot of the British behaviour was, although it's too simplistic to blame the whole thing on what Britain did. And yet, the fact that there was a recognition that the empire had to go, and it was at a fairly early stage in the post-war period. Unlike when you look at, for instance, Belgium, when you look at France, when I think those ideas and that sense of the desire for that degree of influence on the world stage just took longer to die, and there was more barbarism committed by the country in its retreat. You can put some of that credit to Attlee.
And one thing that really struck me is, I think with the exception of Blair in 97, pretty much every Labour government inherits a country that is quite fucked.
Right.
You rarely start from a good position, because it's only when the Tories have, in this case, the Second World War, but normally it's only when the Tories have failed catastrophically. So you're inheriting a mess. And there's this financial crunch, austerity in the old school, not austerity as like some neoliberal project, but as just like, we just do not have the money. Because you've got the Lend-Lease program during the war, which ends immediately with America gives money. And then the Marshall Plan, where you get money for post-war reconstruction, there's 3 years between those two where the money taps from America are basically turned off.
Yeah.
Things get unbelievably grim in 1947. Hugh Dalton warns Attlee, we could finish wonderfully badly, worse perhaps than in 1931.
God.
There's a 1931 drinking game. Like every time somebody goes, oh God, it's 1931. Attlee's approval rating, I want to say plummets, but it goes from 66% to 44%, which I think Keir Starmer would.
He'd be very happy with that.
Very happy with Attlee's nadir. There's an Attlee Must Go campaign from Stafford Cripps and Hugh Dalton. Rather typically, Attlee responds by promoting Cripps. He's constantly bringing people in so they can piss inside the tent. And quite a lot of tension over relationships with the US and how they should proceed in the Cold War. Orwell writes in summer 1948, the Labour government after 3 years, he goes, everyone tired, bored, disappointed.
It's just incredible.
And he points to what we would now call a comms issue. And I know I'm constantly saying these things where it's just like, remind you of anything? But come on. The day-to-day process of telling the public what is happening and why has not been systematically undertaken, nor had the need for it been realised beforehand.
God, incredible. It's absolutely incredible.
So actually it achieved, as we know, quite a lot by 1948. Then it sort of begins to run out of steam. Plus a lot of its major figures are getting very ill, terminally ill. Harold Lasky dies in 1950, Ernest Bevan in 1951, Cripps in 1952. I mean, this is what happens when you have an old cabinet. They call an election in February 1950 to mark Labour's 50th anniversary. Quite why the electorate would care about that, right. I don't know. Due to new constituency boundaries, the majority falls to 6. Even though the popular vote rises by over 1 million, they still get 46%.
Just a little reminder that the subplot of this entire three-part thing is just that the British electoral system is utterly mad.
So then there's problems with over the Korean War. Obviously now there is a war that splits Labour in the traditional way. Yeah. And the formation of the European Common Market, which again, that's going to roll on for decades. And there's a crisis in April 1951, which we've talked about before. We love this crisis. The new Chancellor, Hugh Gaitskell, decides money is needed for defence. spending due to the Korean War. This means cutting the NHS budget by charging users half the cost of dentures and spectacles.
Oh, no.
Attlee is in hospital at the time, so he can't deal with this rift in the way that he normally would. So Nye Bevan and the Board of Trade Minister, young Harold Wilson, resign in a fury.
Yes.
It seems so small, and I read several accounts of this incident, and I still couldn't quite understand why this was a resigning issue. Bevan wasn't at Health at this point. He was at the Minister of Labour. I still didn't quite understand, but I think it wasn't so much, it was partly the threat to that kind of everything is free, but I think it's also the fact that the money was for war. I think perhaps it's those two things.
Well, regardless, it always, whenever you come across this story, just the minuscule nature of the issue and the huge ramifications of what took place because of the resignation, what happens really in just the British left almost over the decades to come, it is an astonishing sort of degree of distance between those two things.
Well, here's a newly elected Labour MP commenting on Bevan's resignation statement. His style was that of a ranting demagogue. It has to be said that he has written the Tory party's best pamphlet yet.
Yeah.
Can you guess who this MP is?
Ooh. No, go on.
Tony Benn.
Oh, wow. Oh, shit. That's incredible.
Sort of pre-left-wing Tony Benn. Election called again because of this very narrow majority, October 1951. Now, this is just peak. Is this peak first past the post fuckery?
I think so.
Surely, right? Labour wins the biggest vote in UK history until then, still the second biggest ever after the Tories in 92. More than the Tories get in this election, an all-time high of 14 million votes, 49% of the electorate, but loses the election.
Yeah. And if we had any sense as a country, that would have been the moment we just closed that shit down.
I know, right?
Why don't we just have the same system everybody else has, in Europe, and we'll have proportional representation of some kind, because up with this, we cannot fucking
You can't win more votes and lose the election. But it seems that you can. And it's so funny how the narrative is. And they were tired. People were dying. They did seem to have run out of energy and ideas. But this idea that kind of Britain just rejected Labour, not really. I mean, yes, technically, but there seems still quite an enormous amount of enthusiasm. And this is the peak of two-party politics. And I think that you have to remember this when you're looking at election results and percentages. What is happening with the other parties that's the story. So 1951 and 55, 96% voted either Labour or Tory.
My God.
So, of course, they're getting high ones because the Liberals are basically dead.
Yes. Well, they killed them.
And in 52 is when Labour membership peaks, just over 1 million.
This is also, by the way, quite indicative of what goes on around the rest of Europe. For the 50s, the left is in disarray.
Yeah.
All over Europe. They've got no power in Britain, no power in France, no power in Germany, no power in Italy. It is just this real after a very left-wing period after the war. It's this period of proper desolation for the left in Western Europe.
It's very odd. I'm going to talk about some of the reasons, but it's not helped by the fact that there is a sense of exhaustion and indeed disappointment. The left says that the government was too cautious and consensual and it didn't abolish the institutions, the lords, the monarchy. Well, I mean, that would have been a tough one.
Well, no, private
schools.
Orwell was always better. Every time Orwell was writing about it, he's just banging on about why haven't they banned the private schools yet? And you're like, I don't know. I mean, but do you even want to notice the fact that they built an NHS? Does that even clock with you?
Well, in his notes for his essay on the Labour Party of 3 years, he's just got National Health Service seems popular. I mean, but this is not just about being eccentric. This rolls on through the left wing, the socialist intellectuals of the 50s and 60s. They fail to seize that chance to radically transform British society. But in many ways, of course, I think that they did.
Maybe that comes down to that thing, that point. First time with a majority, not just in Britain, but in Europe, that it would have felt so seismic. And in socialist history, this is the moment we finally have full control of the government, full control of parliament. And maybe people were expecting, frankly, a more revolutionary series of actions from what was fundamentally a reformist party.
So the 1950s, as you said, Harold Wilson, an amazing phrase maker, he calls this the wilderness years. So Attlee stays on, even though he just feels very, very old, because he's like a 19th century dude and he's surrounded by much younger people now. And he wants to avoid a civil war. A civil war is not avoided. So you basically got the left versus the revisionists. So obviously the line of the left is Nye Bevan. He's 53 by now. They've got the support of Michael Foot at Tribune, Richard Crossman at the New Statesman. So you've also got Harold Wilson and Barbara Castle. Now, I've got to simplify here, but they are still wedded to public ownership as the heart of socialism, as embodied in Clause 4. Most read socialist book of the era is Bevan's book, In Place of Fear. The leader of the revisionists is the Shadow Chancellor Hugh Gaitskell, a 45-year-old economist. The Gaitskellites include Roy Jenkins, who defects from the Bevanites, Anthony Crossland, and James Callaghan. Now, what they're interested in is not so much state ownership, but liberty and equality. And this has been described as the shift from democratic socialism to social democracy, although there is no clear distinction between those two.
Yeah, these words, they're kind of a muddle in and of themselves, really.
Yeah, but I mean, that was how it was seen. It's like once you let go of the idea that nationalisation is the cornerstone, you're in something else that is not quite socialism.
But it's so funny, isn't it? Like, again, these are like the first things from our first episode, but it just happens every time. You give up on that really solid sort of bit of metal that is, socialising and means of production. And then suddenly you just wash that and you're like, is this liberalism now? Because it feels like, they start talking about liberty and keeping shops, all this kind of stuff. It's sort of like once that's not there, no one really, but I know some of them in the Labour Party still believed in socialising the means of production, but like those who still believed in it didn't think it was doable, and very people still wanted to do it anyway. But once they let go of the mast and they didn't have that really bit of solid sort of theoretical, ideological meaning, they just get washed out towards liberalism and start to feel very uncomfortable with who they've become.
Well, I mean, confusingly, Gaitskell's faction, I suppose we call them the Labour right, centrist, revisionist, is called the Socialist Union, and its newspaper is Socialist Commentary. Right. So everybody still wants to be called a socialist. And even saying like left versus right, it is too simplistic. The trade unions don't really like either of them. And, Gaitskell, and this causes a big split with people like Roy Jenkins, very anti-Europe. Famous speech, he goes, what does a federal Europe mean? It means the end of 1,000 years of history. Yeah. You can't get much more leave than that.
There's a general sort of, one of the things that right and left, let's use that terminology here, and this dispute kind of share, is kind of a complete lack of interest. Well, and there's some caveats there, but a large lack of interest in kind of constitutional reforms.
Oh, yeah.
And so, for instance, on electoral reform, which should have been completely obvious for Labour to push for, given the results, that they've just experienced, they're not really interested in it because both right and left want to be in a situation that they have complete control when they get back into Parliament, when they get back into power. Yeah. They're just saying, well, we can tell the Commons what to do as long as we're not in coalition. So there's no support for that. When it comes to the judiciary, you see this sort of attitude of like, well, we don't want to give the judges too many rights because they shouldn't be able to impinge on us. This is all classic Tory stuff. Yeah. When the EEC, as it's about to turn into, and the EU was known as in the past, starts to develop, the first thing that both right and left, frankly, but predominantly the Labour left look at and just think like, well, that just looks like something that could impinge on what we can do when we finally get back into power.
It's chronic. Because people say, Attlee himself, as a public school boy who got on rather well with the royal family, and he instinctively didn't want to reform private schools and the Lords and so on. But then, like you said, it is a pattern from right to left over the decades of not being, largely speaking, not that interested in the constitutional issues, the abolition of that, the reform of that, the devolution of the other. That comes quite a lot later, actually, and is more of a becomes more of like a New Labour thing, doesn't it? They are interested.
And I think partly because by the time we get to New Labour, and we'll see this in the next episode, real concrete practical steps are made to build the bridges with liberalism. Mm-hmm. With a classic kind of old liberal heritage, with liberal individuals, and that's where those kind of conversations are much more current and live and people care about them. In this tradition, it's just not there. And they're fundamentally really quite small c conservative when it comes to any kind of constitutional issues, including Europe.
Now, Labour do what they often do after a defeat, which is they swing to the left. So at the 1952 conference, the Bevanites win 7 of the 8 constituency seats on the NEC. It all becomes very, very tense and stressful. Anyway, after the 1955 election defeated again, Gaitskell beats Bevan and Herbert Morrison, who is now, must be like ancient, to become the new leader. And Gaitskell very smartly appoints Bevan and Wilson to his shadow cabinet. Again, have them pissing inside the tent. So what you're talking about there happening across Western Europe is these big problems for Labour and other socialist parties in the 50s, right? One is the Tories under Churchill and Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, they accept a lot of Attlee's reforms.
Right.
Mixed economy, welfare state, full employment.
Yeah.
They agree broadly on immigration, defence, winding down the empire. So it's harder for Labour to oppose them. This is where we get this word that the Economist coined as a snarky insult, Butskillism, which is the consensus, relative consensus of Gaitskell and the Tory Chancellor, Rab Butler. Right, relatively sort of Keynesian kind of vibe. Actually, of course, they disagreed on lots and lots and lots of things. But there was definitely a sort of kinship between the Tory left and the Labour right.
Yeah.
The other problem is the Tories won the right election at the right time. They reaped the benefits of the post-war recovery. This is a period, obviously, Macmillan sums up as most people have never had it so good.
Yeah.
So you've got this more affluent, more aspirational society.
Which ironically is partly because of the success of Keynesianism.
Exactly. And some, Labour's reforms. And so Labour is actually losing working class voters to the Tories, the more aspirational ones. And one of the revisionists, Douglas Jay, in his book, Must Labour Lose, writes, Labour is in danger of fighting under the label of a class which no longer exists, and even suggests changing the party name.
This is incredible because I'm so sorry. I can't say it every fucking time, but it is literally the same thing that people say right now and that Labour does right now.
40% of working class voters in the 50s considered themselves middle class.
Oh, wow.
They just didn't identify as working class and therefore didn't necessarily identify as Labour. The problem is that both Bevan and Gaitskell are really sniffy about this. Modernity, about affluence, television. They're both in this sort of, they've got elements of that old abstinent tradition of Keir Hardie. Like don't drink, don't gamble, don't have fun.
You remember we covered this as well in our BBC episode, that the television, the sight of the television and the impact it had on people's behaviour really spooked a lot of people out at the time. It made you look, in the same way that people spook out about smartphones now, like everyone's turned into a zombie.
Yeah.
And what previously would have seemed like noisy, bustling communities were now just the family sat silently staring at the flickering image.
Like you hear about smartphones now, yeah. Nye Bevan, this so-called affluent society is an ugly society. It is a society in which priorities have gone all wrong. Now, obviously, I mean, that is a moral position, but it's not very appealing to voters that are glad to be out of the sort of rationing and bomb site era.
Right, yeah.
The best response to this is Anthony Crossland's book, The Future of Socialism. Now, you remember in the first episode, we talked about people like Robert Blatchford and Ben Tillett, who were anti-temperance, really hated what they considered like killjoy socialism. And they were like the working man, beer in Britannia. So Crossland argues that there is this economic consensus, what we're talking about here, the mixed economy, the welfare state, means that socialism should refocus instead, not on means, i.e. nationalisation, but on the ends, personal freedom, happiness and cultural endeavour. More liberal, less statist. He says, a socialist's blood should always include a trace of the anarchist and the libertarian and not too much of the prig and the prude.
In temperament, if not policy, he comes from the Fourier school from our first episode. It's like more like, come on, guys, let's just have some fun. And maybe everyone's just going to shag a little bit and the shops will be open a bit later and we can have a drink. And,
Which is a tradition of socialism going back to the very beginning.
Yeah.
And his famous quote from this book, total abstinence and a good filing system are not now the right signposts to the socialist utopia. Or at least, if they are, some of us will fall by the wayside.
He is a deeply attractive personality, I think.
Just a brilliant character. So 1959, Labour loses for the third time the slogan, very well chosen, life's better with the Conservatives, don't let Labour ruin it. That's Macmillan's slogan. So there is now an even more urgent need to change, to modernise. Gaitskell attempts to overturn Clause 4, that sacred 1918 commitment, ownership of the means of production. Nye Bevan is just, this is like fucking furious. Have we turned our backs on our principles because of a temporary unpopularity in an affluent society? He's really out of step with the times. He has a sense of like what the sacred heart of Labour is, and you cannot change that just because you keep losing elections. This, again, it's a core debate.
It's just extraordinary. I mean, it will never go away, that clause for debate. And at no point does anyone think that they're going to actually do the thing that it says that they're going to do.
It was always symbolic. Anyway, Gaitskell loses that. Clause 4 stays. Bevan, dying of cancer. I am heartily sickened by the Parliamentary Labour Party. It is rotten through and through. It isn't really socialist at all.
There's a quote from Michael Foot in this period that I think sort of sums up the mental state that lots of the Labour left had gotten themselves into. In order to win an election, we have to change the mood of people in this country and open their eyes to what an evil and disgraceful and rotten society it is.
Really?
Yeah. So partly it's judging them for having a car and a washing machine and and then the other part is just any election slogan that starts with "Your country is shit, vote for me." It's not great.
No.
It's just not very effective.
So we'll never know whether Gaitskell would have become Prime Minister, because in 1963 he dies unexpectedly and is replaced by Harold Wilson. I'm fascinated by Harold Wilson. Just such an endlessly complicated person. James Harold Wilson, as I said earlier, born in Huddersfield in 1916, an unbelievable prodigy. Goes from grammar school to Oxford, gets the highest firsts anyone had ever got. Becomes an MP at 29, Shadow Chancellor at 39, Prime Minister at 48. But what surrounds him, I don't know if it still does, but this narrative of disappointment. He is blamed, I think, like Ramsay MacDonald. It's much easier to blame a leader than deeper weaknesses in the party. And I think this applies to criticisms of Jeremy Corbyn as well. I think a lot of the time you look at the face in the window and you go, it's their fault. We've got the wrong leader. And a lot of the time it's much, much deeper issues, issues with the party, things that are changing in the country, things that are changing in the world. It's not all about like which prime minister you've got.
Yeah.
Now he wins he was a Bevanite. He said he resigned with Bevan in 1951. He actually challenged Hugh Gaitskell for the leadership in 1960 from the left. He's the guy that famously says, Labour is a moral crusade or it is nothing.
Right.
It's very good. Although it seems that he probably did not say a week is a long time in politics, which is the one.
Oh, no way, really?
Yeah, apparently he was asked about it. He goes, I don't remember ever saying that. And nobody's been able to, I could not find a source for it, even though it's his most famous quote. But it is a lot. Whoever said it, it's true. A week is a long time in politics. So he sort of comes in as a man of the left, but really he's this very, very canny operator who wants to keep everyone on side because he's been bruised by the Civil War. This is a story that comes over and over in Labour. You've gone through this horrible, bitter period and you just want unity, despite the fact that people are disagreeing over things like Europe, still nationalisation, nuclear weapons. He's the first person, I believe, to call Labour a broad church. And he has to deal with these giant egos. On the right, you've got Dennis Healey, James Callaghan, Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams, Tony Crossland. I mean, these are people that a lot of listeners would be very familiar with. On the left, Barbara Castle, Michael Foot, Tony Benn. And then you've got like factions within factions. And he has this talent that becomes a kind of weakness. He has a talent of seeming to empathise with whoever he's talking to, but then stitching them up. Saying different things to different people. So they end up getting, people who first admire him end up thinking he is completely empty and cynical. Tony Benn says the more successful Harold Wilson becomes, the less attractive he is. And Tony Crosland says,
he would have felt that way about anything that was successful.
Tony Crosland says, Harold is a bastard, but he's also a genius. Again, that is a backhanded compliment that I would personally take. So he's the first Labour leader who actually gets the post-war world and wants to embrace it. Obviously the white heat of the technological revolution. He's really interested in TV and opinion polling, like no Labour leader before him. Distances them a bit from nationalisation in the unions, thinks that perhaps you should reach out to the middle class as well, considering that there's more of them now. So he wins in 1964 with a majority of just 4 seats. For the first time ever, more than half of Labour MPs are graduates. If you think about the changing shape of the Labour Party.
No, that's so important. We've read the little bios for, the Labour guys that have been there, and it's been this real triumph of the working class and a completely different sort of cohort of people than you would normally have in British politics. And now suddenly at this point, it actually becomes quite samey. It's like, okay, no, much like on the other side.
A lot of them are working class. They're like working class grammar school kids who go to Oxford.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's like now when people basically, most of the Labour cabinet is state educated, but also most of them have gone to really good universities. And so it's almost like they lose their working class. They don't have that perceived working classness that somebody like, obviously Keir Hardie, but John Prescott had, right? It's like almost the fact that you've risen from quite humble origins to be a star Oxford graduate is sort of held against you. And it's like, oh, well then.
So, and that all works for your background. What it doesn't cover is the fact that those first sort of Labour figures were workers themselves.
Yes,
do you know
exactly.
what I mean? Like they'd done these jobs, they'd been in those conditions, and they were motivated by stopping that. At this point, that is not the case for the new cohorts coming in.
Absolutely. And this starts really early on. So, I mean, there is a huge narrative of disappointment. Again, squandered opportunity. Now, they do get a proper majority in 66. But to begin with, there's a narrow majority and they inherit a financial crisis, like a massive deficit.
Here we go again. Yeah.
Here we go again. They come in. It's actually really, you think of 1964 as like, it's like Austin Powers Britain. But, enormous challenges. If you look at what they did, I do think it's remarkable. Like they pour money into health, education, sport, comprehensive schools, unraveling the grammar system, university expansion. You get the Open University. That's like drops the voting age to 18. Barbara Castle, she goes on to pioneer the Equal Pay Act. As transport minister, I think you could say she saved more lives than almost any minister ever, other than maybe Nye Bevan through the NHS. Because she introduces a national speed limit, seat belts, and breathalyzer tests.
Incredible.
Things are now it's almost like, well, of course, we always had those. It's like, no, there used to be people driving whatever speed they like with no seatbelt on, pissed to the tits. It's the structural innovations which are less successful. There's a Ministry of Technology which doesn't last. A Minister of Overseas Affairs doesn't last. A Ministry of Economic Affairs doesn't last. Treasury orthodoxy is this fucking crushes them all.
Well, when he introduces that ministry, he's trying to take the Treasury down essentially and to reduce its power, but the Treasury always wins.
And I don't need to tell the author of How Westminster Works this, but Richard Crossman introduces the first version of select committees. Not the system that we have now, but the first things that are called select committees. As we say in the Rivers of Blood episode, mixed on immigration, because they introduced the Commonwealth Immigration Act, having previously denounced the Tory Immigration Act, right? They are feeling that pressure. But you get two Race Relations Acts, and, Harold Wilson gets up, calls Enoch Powell evil, even though most Labour voters probably supported Enoch Powell. Yeah. The most lasting achievements are due to the Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins. As you know, big Roy Jenkins stan. I think what he achieved was unbelievable, given the circumstances. So he's born in 1920, the son of a miner and a Labour MP, elected in 1948, incredibly left-wing MP at this point. He writes a pamphlet called Fair Shares for the Rich, calling for mass nationalisation, the abolition of private schools, a 95% top tax rate. He later calls it Robespierrean. And then he just defects to Gaitskell. Very quickly moves to the right, passionate pro-European. And there's a lovely passage in this 1959 pamphlet, The Labour Case, where he carries on that Tony Crossland argument, like just let people live. And I mean, this is very Ian friendly. I feel like I'm pandering.
No, this is good. Can I just say how much I'm enjoying the pandering right now? It's very pleasant for me.
Let us be on the side of those who want people to be free to live their own lives, to make their own mistakes, and to decide in an adult way, and provided they do not infringe the rights of others, the code by which they wish to live. And on the side, too, of experiment and brightness, of better buildings and better food, of better music and better books, of fuller lives and greater freedom. In the long run, these things will be more important than even the most perfect of economic policies.
It's so lovely, isn't it?
But is it socialist?
No.
Tony Benn just said he's an Asquithian liberal, not Labour in any significant sense.
I just think, the Asquithian is just...
Don't even know what I mean.
Well, it's just not useful for the kind of freedom that he's talking about. But it's obviously liberalism. And then all the stuff that we remember then, divorce and theatre censorship from this era, all the big reforms, abortion, these are all liberal. That really is what the core memories of the reforms of this period are of liberal policymakers.
What I find amazing about him is that Wilson, who, by all accounts, anti-racist, pro-feminist, he wasn't that invested in these liberal reforms, but he allowed Jenkins to do them. That's another great aspect of leadership, where you just allow a minister who has a real vision to do their thing. The press calls it the permissive society. Jenkins preferred to call it the civilized society.
Yes.
And what he was doing, he was running ahead of both his party and the public. And so in order to not create a cabinet split over certain issues, he would encourage private members' bills. This is what decriminalizes abortion and homosexuality, what liberalizes divorce. It's private members' bills which have Jenkins' backing, but it's not Jenkins' policy. And so very cunning as well as principled.
So now when people ask, why is the assisted dying bill going through as a private member's bill rather than a government bill? The reason is because he almost sort of creates the kind of constitutional convention, just by the whims of precedent, by using this mechanism to sort of have this kind of layer of deniability and informality to the proceedings, that then sort of becomes the way that people assume these kind of issues are dealt with, for good or ill.
There's social conservatives in cabinet, like James Callaghan, and they're not necessarily going to want, if you just come through and just goes, I want to introduce a bill to decriminalise homosexuality, you wouldn't get the whole cabinet on side. Yeah. So this is probably, these are the sort of lasting, what's the most significant achievements of the Wilson government. Again, things that we take for granted.
And he's specifically right in saying that they did have that effect more than the economic policy. This fundamentally changes what it is to be British. Like what we think of as living in this country. And we talk about it like a tolerant society or, to each his own, all these sort of core ideas that we think make up what it is that we are. Most of this stuff comes from him because that is very much not the attitude that people had until this point.
Because Andrew Marr actually goes so far as says that you could call this the Jenkins years rather than the Wilson years.
Right, yeah.
So there's, maybe a little unfair on Wilson, but there's a case for it. So anyway, unfortunately, Wilson gets derailed by devaluation of the pound, a subject that always just fills me with immense boredom. It's incredibly significant, but basically they should, because of this balance of trade deficit, they should have done it as soon as they got into office, like day one, just you can take the punt. So devaluing the pound it looks bad. You take the political hit, but it's better to do it sooner rather than later, I think. Which I think is another message for governments. Just like, if something's going to be painful, just get it over with. Anyway, they're forced to do it in 1967. And this is kind of the first threat to the post-war consensus, because what it relies on is economic growth, low inflation, full employment, good industrial relations, all of those things. That's how you produce social mobility and reduce inequality. And if growth is slowing, then you're in big trouble. Labour during the Wilson government, which again, I look back on and seems to be quite successful. Ken Livingstone, who goes on to run the Greater London Council and become London Mayor. So joining in 1968 was like being a rat who was boarding a sinking ship. Membership figures plummeting. People just very unhappy with Wilson, partly over support for the Vietnam War. Kind of support. I mean, he doesn't oppose it, but then he also says, I'm not sending any British troops.
Yeah.
But it is seen as he is supporting a very unpopular war.
He doesn't feel that he can talk back to the Americans on it, essentially. Yeah. But he is not, he puts up with all of the attempts to put British lives there and stops it from happening. And that, he deserves a huge amount of credit for that. But you're not ever going to get any credit for that at the time, because every day, in much the same way as we've seen recently with Gaza, the main demand will be like, why haven't you condemned it? How can you allow this murder of children and families to go on while saying, while essentially trying to, justify it publicly?
Labour's once again stuck. It's just like they're associated with this horror, but they can't tell America to fuck off.
Exactly, yeah. And moral life in the 20th century becomes much harder when you can't tell America to fuck off, as various Labour administrations have found.
And particularly it's Lyndon Johnson. It's not even like,
exactly.
It's not like it's not a Donald Trump figure. It's a Democratic president. So Jenkins and Callaghan, basically they swap jobs. So James Callaghan, who was the Chancellor, he's kind of a disgrace. He becomes Home Secretary. It suddenly just stops all the permissive reforms. apart from, I think, the Second Race Relations Act. Jenkins becomes Chancellor, steadies the ship, becomes enormously popular, drives Wilson mad because everyone keeps talking about Jenkins as the next leader. People are constantly speculating that Wilson's going to be removed, just as there was speculation that Attlee would be removed. And there's always speculation. And because his authority is declining, he can't push through Barbara Castle's white paper for taming the unions in place of strife. It's such a big part of this, of Labour history, the failure.
Also, that's a great title for a white paper.
We don't have... It's like a novel.
Yeah, it's lovely. I just really think white papers should have vaguely poetic titles. And I just think it's a tradition that we've really let go.
Maybe because it failed.
Yeah, maybe because it was such a shit show. It's not the greatest forecast.
So it might have given you a very different relationship between governments and the unions in the 1970s. But there's too much opposition in cabinet. Its main opponent is Callaghan, which makes sense because he's from a union background, but is ironic considering that it's the unions who will bring him down 10 years later. It's very much the tiger face-eating party, isn't it? Who knew the unions would eat my face? And you're getting a lot of criticism from the New Left. I'm going to do an episode on the New Left, right? And the New Left also didn't like the Attlee. It's massive, just tremendous, endless disappointment with the Labour Party. The Marxist academic Ralph Miliband, father of Ed and David, writes Parliamentary Socialism. He calls Labour's willingness to compromise with the establishment the sickness of Labourism and says it can never be a socialist party and you have to have an alternative. One of the biggest obstacles to developing socialism in this country is the Labour Party, which I think you would hear now probably from supporters of your party and so on.
Wow, sorry. I'm not used to the name your party.
No, I don't
yet.
like it.
So when you said that, I'm just like, fuck are you talking about?
Ian has his own party now.
Thank you, that's
please.
good. Would they say such things?
Please sign up on Patreon. You'll get mugs and policies and robust liberalism. So there's a whole other movement going on, like feminist C&D activists, that they hate Labour. They see it as not just too right-wing, but too paternalistic, too technocratic. There's this whole kind of like young grassroots socialist energy, which includes militants, but we're going to talk about militants at another point.
And their tendencies.
And there are many tendencies. So Harold Wilson expects to be re-elected in 1970, but loses to Ted Heath's Tories. This is the first big drop in the working class vote for Labour. It goes down from 70 to 60%, which at the time isn't really registered as a big deal, but becomes a big deal. So they go into opposition. They swing left again. They argue a lot about Europe. So you've got Roy Jenkins, who ends up resigning as deputy leader in 1972 over Wilson committing to a referendum because they're so divided that he just thinks, how the fuck am I going to fix this? The referendum is the idea of Tony Benn, who predicts, actually, fair play, what will happen a decade later, a Labour split producing a pro-European centre party led by Roy Jenkins and a Tribune left led by Michael Foot. That is in his diaries from like 71, 72.
Oh, no. Okay, fair enough.
Exactly what happened. So the unions are also moving left, really for the first time. Like we said, they often represented the right of the party. You've got some more factions here. The rise of the Tribune Group, named after the newspaper, about 80 MPs. Very confusingly, right? This is when you get the left-wing Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, which becomes Tony Benn's big vehicle. It's still around now. But then there's a right-wing splinter party called the Campaign for Social Democracy.
No, for fuck's sake. Find
more words. This season of Roger Story is begging you to find more words. And everybody, they're sounding really radical, much more radical than I imagined. There's something called the Alternative Economic Strategy, mass nationalisation, worker control. Culminates in a very radical manifesto in 1974 to bring about a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of working people and their families.
That alternative economic strategy is almost the Bible of the Labour left for about 10 years. You know, it's just because obviously it's not implemented. It's not really clear how on earth you would implement any of it. It generally looks like it would be pretty fucking terrible if you tried. But it becomes the mech. It's just like, you know, we've just got to get into power and then we'll do it. And so oddly, what then I think happens is that the Labour left sort of stops talking about policy once that exists, because it's got the thing that it's going to do. And instead, all of its thinking is sort of machinations as to how it will make sure that it has a prime minister that will do it, which isn't really about winning elections. It's mostly about, making sure that there's nothing in the party that will stop them. They assume that party membership's going to always be very left-wing. So it's like, give the party membership the votes over the leader, make sure the MPs are subject to recall. It's always these various things to try and stop any resistance within Labour to some future sci-fi prime minister introducing the gospel as they have written it.
Well, of course, the person driving all of that is Tony Benn, who we should meet properly. Born in London in 1925, his father, William Wedgwood Benn, was a Liberal MP who switched to Labour in 1928, served in the cabinets of Ramsay MacDonald and Clement Attlee, and was made a peer. But back then, you couldn't be just a peer for life. It was like if you were made a peer, then that was carried on through your kids. So Tony Benn becomes an MP in 1960, but when his dad dies, he has to join the Lords. And then he has to renounce his title and return to the Commons in 1963.
He had to fight for the right to renounce his title, didn't he? That was,
It was a really big deal. And because of that, a lot of people thought that he was some toff. And it was like, his dad had literally, just been made a peer. He's no more a toff than Ian Botham. He's a peer, isn't he?
Okay.
I don't know. I was trying to think of a definitely not posh member of the House of Lords.
It's fascinating to me that was the first name available to you.
Beefy Botham. Now, Benn is a very rare figure because he moves from the centre of the party to the far left. By his own admission, before 1968, he was just a career politician. He preferred Gaitskell to Bevan. He was very supportive of party unity, quite cautious and conservative. He became famous for cracking down on pirate radio stations. He was not down with the youth. But in 1968, that magic year for the, he attends a student sit-in in Bristol, where they have talks and seminars. And he has basically a road to Damascus conversion and becomes obsessed with the New Left. And he writes, I realized all of a sudden that for 3.5 or 4 years, I've done absolutely no basic thinking about politics.
Incredible.
I mean, he's very open about what he didn't know because he's very charismatic and not very intelligent, but not intellectual. He didn't read much. He did not read the Communist Manifesto until his wife Caroline gave it to him for Christmas in 1976.
What a fucking Christmas present.
He writes, it is the most astonishing thing, and I feel so ignorant at the age of 51 as a socialist politician in Britain, I should never have read that basic text before.
Yeah, I mean, also, especially because, and I can't stress this enough, it's really very short.
You could read it in an hour. He probably did, on Christmas Day. So he's got such a weird take on socialism because in some ways it's all about democratic accountability and structures. It's quite mechanical in some ways. In other ways, it's sort of quasi-religious, and he harks back to Robert Owen and the cooperative movement, the diggers and the levellers during the English Civil War.
The Peasants' Revolt. I remember he'd always talk about Wat Tyler.
So he's got a huge sense of kind of, romantic tradition, but also kind of really getting into the nuts and bolts of party membership and resolutions. I've found this great phrase, which I love, to describe Labour, resolutionary socialism.
That's fucking great.
It's brilliant. And there was a survey of students at Essex University, the most left-wing university in the country, found that only 2% identified as Labour in the late 60s.
Jesus.
So Benn publishes The New Politics, a socialist reconnaissance, where he calls for Labour to be more open, ally with these young protest groups. He's got something. He's onto something that you should basically, there's this youthful left-wing energy that Labour is completely ignoring. But he moves left in lots of other ways. In 4 years, he goes from mildly supporting the EEC to calling for a referendum to calling it the decapitation of British democracy. I mean, literally, he just flips. And I have some sympathy for him because he was absolutely demonized by the media. He gets death threats. The day before the 74 election, Kingsley Amis calls him the most dangerous man in Britain.
Right.
Just for being left-wing, basically.
Yeah.
But there is something, I think, unnerving about that speed of transformation. So he has a clash with Dennis Healey, who was more on the right. But during the 30s of being a student communist for anti-fascist reasons. He was a communist for about sort of 3 years at Oxford and going into the army. And he goes, well, I at least am not an ex-communist. And Healey says, well, perhaps it would have been better if you had been through these experiences when you were young.
I can respond to that very profoundly.
So that you can see why Ben, in some ways very charming, in some ways incredibly off-putting, this kind of gleam in his eye of the zealot.
I think there's also, for people my age, it's strange because there's this afterlife to him. Yeah. Where he's just very cuddly.
Very cuddly.
It's like very gentle. I remember seeing this sort of video of him after he did a stage show and he would sit on the stage during the interval. I remember this couple goes up to him, said, "Oh, well, actually, we're Conservative voters really came." And I remember just instantly he was like, "Oh, I do hope I haven't said anything that offended you." And, but, he was just a very different guy. And then when you read about how he behaved at the peak of his career, he's your Begbie right there. Like, it's just, he is starting fights, he is smashing pub glasses, he is trying to produce lasting damage.
So much of it is that it starts in 1968 and then it accelerates this process. In his own words on Desert Island Disc, he says, "I was radicalized."
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, as I said, Harold Wilson expected to win the 1970 election and lost. Then he expected to lose the 1974 election, but won. He was literally planning his retirement. So, as in 1929, Labour does worse than the Tories, but forms a minority government, then has to call another election in October, gets a majority of 3. This is not a good start. So there's these fundamental problems. One is a weak position, right? Minority in a country where it's just bouncing from crisis to crisis to crisis. Like, you can't write about this period without using the word crisis too often. Yeah. I've tried it. I failed.
Yes, quite right.
2, he doesn't really want to be Prime Minister again because he was planning to retire. And that wiliness that he had, that ability to get people on side, now just makes him seem really untrustworthy and unprincipled. If you look at like the accounts in memoirs and diaries and stuff, it goes from like, "Oh, I quite admire the way that Harold solved that problem," to being, "What a Weasley piece of shit."
Right, interesting.
And he's becoming very weird and sort of paranoid and just doesn't want to be there. Third problem, because he didn't think he would win, he agreed to this radical manifesto that he did not want to implement. And so immediately has to start backtracking. So he's got this alternative economic strategy, right? But he makes his chancellor Dennis Healey, who does not believe in it.
Yes.
And he makes Tony Benn industry secretary and then constantly undermines him and waters down his industry bill. And this is when Tony Benn goes, he gets completely radicalized by this disappointment, by feeling undermined. So he develops this messianic sense of himself as the sort of envoy of the membership, the true voice of Labour. So he just doesn't have many friends in cabinet or the civil service. Barbara Castle says Wedgie, which is what they called him, Wedgwood Ben, sits very pontifically these days, looking as though he has access to some secret and superior wisdom. Like, not a team player, I would say at this point. Fourthly, Europe. So Wilson agrees to this Ben's idea for a referendum in order to avoid a split. Labour doesn't take a position on Europe. It allows ministers a free vote. I suppose this is like peak Wilson.
Yeah, it's
in terms of that kind of just absolute ruthless game playing.
Also, I think, as you wrote, I think in the centrism book, sort of peak centrist Britain, really. It's just this moment where on the pro-European side, all these guys who otherwise consider themselves Tories or Labour or whatever, just suddenly find themselves thinking, hang on, maybe there's more that unites than divides us.
Well, I think we have to do like the European Union at some point, right? So I'm not going to go into the details here, but what it says about Wilson, he gets accused of just this being a fudge. And he says in cabinet, you talk about a messy middle of the road muddle. I'm at my best in a messy middle of the road muddle. And the referendum works out really nicely for him. 1975, the Tories and the Liberals support staying in. Most of the media, business, celebrities, etc. Yes wins by 2-1. And it also works because Ben, campaigning for no, has to line up. He won't share a platform.
Right.
He's on the same side as Enoch Powell, the nationalist parties, the National Front and the Communist Party. So obviously the Labour left gets associated with the extremes of British politics. And that gives Wilson an excuse to kind of kick him out of industry department, which is what he wanted to do anyway. So you've got some achievements here, I mean, things that matter a lot to people's lives: Sex Discrimination Act, Third Race Relations Act, Health and Safety at Work, statutory maternity leave, domestic violence legislation, things that don't get talked about on the top line, right?
Yeah.
But actually really affect people's lives. And I think that's one of the stories of Labour governments. there's a lot of things that you kind of forget because you concentrate on these huge events, like the Winter of Discontent or the Iraq War or whatever, and just this stuff that beds into British life and just makes life better.
Yes.
You sort of forget where it came from. Like, who introduced this,
Yeah.
Generally seen as a failure. He retires in 1976 at the age of 60, which is younger than Keir Starmer was when he entered number 10, but looks a lot older.
Yeah.
As people did back then.
Indeed.
Him particularly. Asked by the BBC to name his biggest achievement, he says, holding the party together.
Oof.
It's a bit depressing.
It's also a very Labour answer.
It's a very Labour answer.
That is ultimately where your concerns are, this internal fucking circus.
The leadership contest shows this is technically true. Michael Foot from the left, he narrowly wins the first round. Then in the final round, he narrowly loses to James Callaghan from the right. So it is not a decisive result. And in the centre, if you've seen the play The Gang of Three, we went to see the play The Gang of Three. It's very good.
We had a great time.
It explains how Roy Jenkins, Dennis Healey and Tony Crossland couldn't agree on who should run, and so they sort of cancelled each other out.
I think when we went to see that play, half of our audience was in there because I just remember we were sat there, we just got the meeting origin story, people would go, which was also just like, this is almost weirdly embarrassing. We don't always socialise together. We just need to be clear.
Why are you out together? Roy Jenkins basically gives up on Labour, takes a job as president of the European Commission. We will see what he does next in the third episode. So, nearing the end of this, James Callaghan basically inherits the same problem. Divided cabinet, divisions on Europe, nationalisation, nuclear weapons, a lot of the same issues from like 25 years earlier, I think. So, like I said, working class, grew up in poverty, didn't go to university, started work at 17. Once admitted, because of his lack of education, I never had a really developed theory of socialism. He felt really self-conscious about this, perhaps because he was surrounded by graduates in that generation. I don't think somebody would have felt like that in 1920.
Yeah.
From the socially conservative authoritarian Labour tradition that we see, someone like David Blunkett, I think, is in.
Yes, very good.
Law and order, family values, like you say, as soon as you placed Jenkins as Home Secretary, he said he wanted to call a halt to the rising tide of permissiveness.
Right, yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Like women being able to, have abortions. And
things like that. Gay men not being arrested.
Yeah.
Still, the only person in British history to have held all four great offices of state. Prime Minister, Chancellor, Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary.
Oh, wow.
That has never been repeated. Much more well-liked than Wilson, even by his opponents. Much more popular than Margaret Thatcher, who was obviously leading the Tories at this point. Very good on TV. Just really, really well-liked. In the Ben diaries, he talks about meeting with Wilson and coming away going, what a snake. He talks about meeting Callaghan, who was further to the right, and just go, lovely chat with Jim. Personal skills, there's lots to be said for those. So what went wrong? And what went wrong were things partly beyond his control. So another play that we can mention here, James Graham's This House.
Also very good.
Really good. This parliament was a nightmare, right? There's the tiny majority that gets eaten away by elections. So Callaghan has to make a deal with the Liberals, then that falls apart. He has to make another deal with the Scottish and Welsh nationalist parties. Everything is razor thin. Like, MPs have to be dragged from their hospital beds to pass crucial votes. It is a nightmare for the whips, and just for the whole party trying to get anything done. And then there's all these crises: public spending crisis, inflation crisis, trade union crisis, a crisis. Like, it never fucking stops. And somebody who I think comes out of this extremely well, mentioned him earlier, is the Chancellor, Dennis Healey, who, what a man. He was like I said, a sort of student communist, becomes an army major in the Second World War, fights in Italy, defense secretary in the 1960s, co-founded the Bilderberg Group, conspiracy theorist fans may be interested, becomes a TV celebrity.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah.
So when people made fun of him, he just appeared on their shows making fun of himself, like doing the catchphrases. An amazing wordsmith. When people talk about politicians having a hinterland, that's Dennis Healey. If you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. That's Dennis Healey.
Much better than what we had before.
Yeah. Just very good as a kind of like celebrity and also a heavyweight. So it's a fucking nightmare. I can't think of any job I would have liked less than Chancellor during this period. Presented more mini budgets than any other modern Chancellor. Has to make wave after wave of cuts, but still manages to keep the money for like house building, pension increases, universal child benefit, etc., by raising the top rate of tax and stuff. It did make me think of Rachel Reeves and just like how much more deft he was at finding solutions to very, very tough problems.
And we should obviously say that in context, we've gone through this period a million times in a million different episodes, but this is the collapse of Keynesianism, really. Right. It's it's obviously not just happening in Britain, it's happening all over the place, rising oil prices, stagflation, and just this pulverizing, really punishing economic context in which people are operating, in which their usual methods for resolving economic problems have ceased to function.
Now, the biggest crisis, and I'm going to bring it up here, not in the kind of end of Keynesianism thing, although that is obviously part of that, but in how it affects labour. So Treasury says, look, we're screwed. You've got to go to the IMF to get a bailout. So he goes to get a £3 billion loan, which is going to require another $2 billion of cuts. So party conference is running. Healey is on his way to Manila for a crucial IMF meeting. Callaghan orders him to turn back from the airport at the last minute because conference is about to vote down the loan and the cuts. So he gets in there. He's not on the schedule. So when he gets to Blackpool, he has to speak from the floor. He has 5 minutes to make his case, during which he is heckled and booed.
Oh, my God.
But wins the vote. I mean, a quite extraordinary performance. This is, as you said, when Callaghan makes his famous speech where he renounces Keynesianism and full employment, which goes further than what Healey wanted. Milton Friedman, the neoliberal economist, called it one of the most remarkable speeches which any government leader has ever given. And I think it's maybe this, not Thatcher's election.
Well, in both
the beginning of that.
The UK and the US, it is the party on the left that gives up on the left-wing economics that have functioned since the post-war, since the end of the war. And that then authorizes the right to go much further in the other direction. But the rot starts on the left. Well,
and Healey always maintained it was because the other thing wasn't working. He was like, this is, what else can you do?
Yeah.
It wasn't like some ideological choice that they made, right? Obviously, this completely buries the alternative economic strategy. Is seen as a very great betrayal. Tony Benn, the smell of 1931 is very strong in my nostrils.
Fuck me.
Take a shot. Anyone playing the 1931 game. It's an incredibly strange situation. Callaghan says, if we were to fail, I do not think any government could succeed. I feel it would lead to a totalitarian government of the left or the right.
Wow.
It was like a very, very, very feverish time about which I cannot stop reading. I'm absolutely obsessed with just how fraught all that was. Healey is a relatively level-headed figure at a time when everyone's going bananas. It turns out the economy wasn't as bad as it looked. The Treasury predictions were wrong. The government didn't need the bailout in the first place. It only takes half the money and then very quickly pays it back.
Yeah.
So by 1978, the growth is up, inflation is falling, Labour ahead in the polls. So this is when Callaghan should call an election. But he gets spooked by some new polling, whether they're losing their lead, and he just makes that terrible mistake of let's wait and see if things get better.
Thank God that no future Labour leader made that sort of error, or else they'd really be in trouble.
It's not an error Labour would make twice. So what does happen instead, of course, is the winter of discontent, which obviously people know about it, just an unbelievable head-on clash with the unions, producing indelible images that the Tories will use against Labour till the end of time. And
producing images like, rubbish that's not being collected, and almost, it's part of that clash with the unions, just a general sense of the degradation in the very basic functions of British society, that sense of we have to try some new kind of party now, some alternative to this, because it is clear that coexistence with the unions simply isn't going to work.
But of course, the reality was not as dire as those images where they go bodies unburied, because I think there was a gravedigger strike for 1 week. And in people's heads, it's literally this corpse is piled high, in fucking 28 days later or something. So anyway, there was a tragic arc to this because Callaghan comes from the unions. This is meant to be what he is good at. That is meant to be his great skill. It's meant to be Labour's skill. You know how to deal with the unions. It all falls apart. Then in April 79, there's a vote of no confidence because there was a plan for devolution, which failed for various reasons, which loses the Scottish and Welsh nationalists. No confidence vote is lost by a single vote, and Callaghan has to call an election. This is, I think, the origin of the quip. This is the first time I've heard of turkeys voting for an early Christmas.
Oh, really?
Yeah, meaning that if you think Labour isn't delivering on devolution, wait till you see Margaret Thatcher. The Tories win 44% to 37%, majority of 43%. Margaret Thatcher, the anti-socialist crusader, becomes prime minister.
We have an episode on Margaret Thatcher if you want to just jump off and
find out about her.
Yeah.
And Labour becomes a suicide club again. That's where we're going to leave this episode with, I guess, the end of the post-war consensus and another 18 years in the wilderness.
It's okay. Spoilers.
Okay, it takes them a while is all I'm going to say.
Who knows, guys? Maybe everything will be fine in the next episode. Thank you very much for joining us for another episode of Origin Story. As you can tell, this all takes a tremendous amount of work and would not be possible without our patron supporters who give us financial assistance as we do all of this research. If you sign up now, you get merch, you get money off the live shows, you get each episode a week in advance, and you get the special episodes that we make just for our patron supporters. But most importantly, you get to feel that you've contributed to the sum total of human knowledge and against the obscurantism and ignorance of our current media environment.
So, yeah, you can help us out in that way. You can also help by just spreading the word on, I think we're now on every social media platform where we attract a real variety of audiences. So you can do that. You can review us on platforms. You can comment nicely. You can tell a friend. And I think people are probably quite interested in the Labour Party at this particular point in time and its troubles and travails. So, yeah, spread the word. And if you're interested in the sources, of which there are many for these episodes, you can find them on the Patreon page or the show notes on your podcast platform.
Thank you very much, guys. We'll be back next week with the history of the Labour Party from Michael Foot to Keir Starmer. See you then.
Origin story for the many, not the few.